Hello and welcome back to the free online woodworking school. In this video, we're going to begin creating a veneered top for this table. So I should stipulate before we start, I am no expert in veneering, but I do know the basics and that's what I'm going to be teaching you today. If you do want to dive down the rabbit hole, there is no better book to learn veneering than this one by Scott Grove. I'll put a link to it in the description. It just opens an entirely new world in terms of what's possible with veneering, but also covers the basics really well. So there's a link to that in the description, but if you just want to know the basics to get you by, this video is for you. So just to cover what veneer is, it's effectively very, very thin slices of wood that are stuck to a substrate below, often plywood or MDF, but can also be solid wood sometimes, that's used as a way of being more economical with wood, both in terms of sustainability and also cost, because all of a sudden to create a tabletop you've only got two sheets that are paper thin rather than a big thick slab of wood that's obviously going to take more from the tree. The beauty of working with veneer is not only does it allow you access to more kind of exotic, hard to get timbers that are only really economical to buy in veneer form thanks to the high yield you get from each log, but also the patterns you can create from veneer, such as doing book matching or slip matching or radial matching, are effects that cannot be created through any other means other than using veneer. This particular stuff I'm using here is walnut, and it's a decorative veneer, which is usually sold at 0.6 millimeters thick. I don't know what the imperial conversion is for that. Whereas you can also get something called constructional veneer, which is usually around 2 or 3 millimeters thick. Constructional veneer can be used in exactly the same way as decorative veneer, just to cover a surface in order to hide a substrate below, but also because of the thickness makes it slightly more durable. But constructional veneer is also used for processes such as laminating, where you want to create a bend in wood using a series of thin layers. And so that's the main difference. Decorative 0.6 millimeters, constructional 2 or 3 millimeters roughly. And so today we're going to be using decorative. Now I've been holding these sheets as kind of an example for now because this is actually going to be the underside of the table. And so the substrate we're going to stick these to will be a block of 18 millimeter MDF. This has actually been cut to its final size, and what we'll do is we'll stick the veneer to it and then trim off the excess afterwards. And as for the top, that is what I've got in here. In this kind of setup, I've got a series of sheets of burl veneer, which is basically a growth on the side of a tree. It's kind of this like lumpy bumpy thing, and it creates this amazing pattern in the wood when they're harvested. The trouble with them is that because of the crazy grain direction, they buckle and bubble all over the place. And so for the past few days, I've been flattening it. I purchased a veneer flattening solution in order to do this, saturated all of the leaves front and back with the solution, and then clamped this between these two pieces of plywood with a layer of paper towel in between each leaf, which would help soak away that veneer flattening solution by replacing the paper towels periodically. Eventually, you get to a point where the paper towels stop soaking up any more of the solution, and then you know you're sorted. That's where we're at here, so let's take a look. So you can see the paper towels are completely dry now. And there's our first sheet of walnut burl, completely flat, and it's going to be much better to work with compared to what it was previously like, where it was just all over the place. Now each of these sheets are also numbered, so that's 11. This one says 10 up there. And this is always worth doing when you purchase veneer like this. Keep the leaves stored consecutively like this, because it's what will allow you to create all these sort of cool effects that we're going to be creating in a second. So there we go, there's our pack of consecutive walnut burl. And by keeping it consecutive like this, you can start doing things like this. What I've just done there is called a book match, but you can even take it further and open it up again and create all sorts of crazy patterns. With solid wood, you tend to only be able to do one book match like this, where you resaw a piece of timber down the middle and open it up. But doing a second match like this, where this timber on the left and this one on the right are still the same, is a benefit that's kind of only reserved for veneering. But let's not forget, we don't necessarily need to reflect sideways. We can also do a book match end to end, such as this. And by doing that, we start creating this really cool star pattern in the middle, or we could do it this way round. And again, that's just creating a really nice pattern in the middle there that everything is just radiating out from. So yeah, veneering is pretty damn cool. It has got a bit of a bad rep because it's associated with cheap furniture. And while that is the case, much of this cheap furniture that people are associating veneer with is often actually a laminate, which is even thinner than veneer and is just printed essentially onto a sheet of chipboard or whatever ever. Veneer like this is used on all sorts of high quality furniture, and so don't shun it away as something cheap and nasty and to be avoided, because in a lot of cases it hits quite the opposite. Anyway, let's begin experimenting with this and see what pattern we can start creating for the top of this table. So these are the 4 leaves that I want to match, and I think, like I kind of showed you earlier, I want to create that sort of pattern in the middle with the sapwood. I think that'll come out looking like a really nice pattern. We've got a few splits that we need to contend with when putting this together, and we can fix those to some extent and do some repairs after it's all stuck down. But for now, we just need to double check the layout. So in terms of numbers, we've got 4, 5, 6, and 7. And so they're going consecutively anti-clockwise. The problem is 4 and 7 are now 3 leaves apart. And so by the time you get that far apart in the pack, the grain won't match up as well. So what we want to do is kind of rearrange these so that the leaves are no more than 2 apart. Easiest way to do that is just simply flip 6 onto there, 7 back here, and now these 2 leaves were still next to each other, these 2 leaves were next to each other, and these were only 2 apart, these were only 2 apart. It doesn't always play out this way. Sometimes you might need to mess around with them and get a better match in the middle, but for me that's created a much better match across all 4 of these leaves, and so we're going to go for that. So with a white pencil, we'll just do a idiot's triangle across them, and then we can start moving on to the next stage. So the way I would approach this is by doing it in 2 stages. The first stage is to get the left hand side done and the right hand side done. It's kind of 2 stages within the first stage. And then the second stage, with those attached together with tape and a little bit of glue that I'll show you later, we'll then re-square that middle section so the 2 halves can come together nice and seamless in the middle. So this is the first join I'm going to make, and it doesn't look like we've got any splits or damage on there, and so we can just start edge jointing these together in order to create a seamless join. And to do that, we're going to use a shooting board. So I prefer to do this against the edge of a bench just because it makes clamping a bit easier. We've got a flat base of plywood, and then we've got 2 more pieces of plywood that were actually just used to flatten these pieces of veneer, and these are going to be used to hold the veneer flat while we joint it. So we'll just put it between the 2 sheets of plywood and get it so there's no more than about 3 millimeters sticking out of it. Ideally even less, because the more you've got poking out when we're edge jointing it, the more it's going to flex and cause issues when it comes to edge jointing, and in fact it might even break. And so you just want to make sure it's really well supported across the whole length with as little as possible sticking out. And then with the plane on its side and a really light cut, not too much pressure, we're just going to go along and start shaving away that edge. So now we can just sort of shimmy it round until we get a nice grain match all the way down. You might not get it perfect, especially if the leaves are 2 apart, but you can generally get it pretty damn close. Just don't assume that the ends should meet up perfectly, because they probably won't at this stage. We can trim that down to fit later. So that'll do for the time being, and so we're going to start taping them up. Now traditionally, veneer was taped together using something called veneer tape. Very original, I know. And this is a type of tape that you needed to wet the back on before sticking it down. And when the tape dries out, it starts shrinking ever so slightly, and in doing so ends up closing the gaps in the leaves. Now personally, I've never got on with this stuff. I've always found it to be messy, I've found it difficult to remove, and I never actually find it pulls the leaves together that well. I'm sure it's just me doing something wrong, or I'm buying bad quality tape because it's worked for craftspeople for years. But for me, I just don't get on with it, and so I tend to prefer a more modern solution. Now, there's a new rabbit hole to this. With veneering, you've got 2 methods of clamping it down. You've got what's called a hot press, and you've got a cold press. In large industrial workshops, they tend to use what's called a hot press. And in this process, the glue that's used to bond the veneer to the substrate is cured by heat. This is done in large presses where 2 pieces of metal can be warmed, and they actually get kind of hot to touch. And as soon as you press it together, the veneer panel can be done in as little as 10 minutes, probably even quicker, to be honest. And so you can imagine for large scale manufacture, they can get a lot of panels veneered in one day. However, the alternative is what's called a cold press. This is what most of us are used to when it comes to gluing things flat, and it's just doing so without any added warmth. And so you tend to have to wait for the full cure time of the glue before taking things out the press. And obviously this is going to be more accessible to a lot of people, but it's not going to have the kind of turnaround that a hot press would have. The reason I'm going down this rabbit hole is because this tape here is suitable for cold presses only. If you use this in a hot press, it's going to become a sort of sticky mess that's going to be very difficult to remove. And so I'll put a link to this in the description below, as well as the hot press equivalent of this tape, should you have access to that kind of equipment. But One thing I will say, do not use masking tape for this, regardless of whether you're doing a cold press or a hot press. Using masking tape to stick veneer together is okay when sticking it together, but as soon as you clamp it flat, all of the adhesive in the masking tape squeezes out, it seeps into the grain, and it not only makes it difficult to remove the masking tape afterwards, but also just leaves this horrible residue behind that's really difficult to remove. In fact, that's actually one of the benefits of using the old style veneer tape that is activated with water, because in order to remove it, all you need to do is wet it again, let that kind of saturate into the tape, and then it peels straight away. It never does that easily, but in theory it does. But yeah, tangent aside, this is linked in the description, hot press is in the description, don't use masking tape. So with things matched up, we're just gonna get a bit of tape across the join. And I mentioned just now that the old style veneer tape kind of shrunk when it dried out. You can kind of make this tape do the same thing by just lightly stretching it across the join. Not much at all, just a little bit, and by sticking it down, the sort of elasticity of the tape should pull the join nice and tight. So you can do that every couple of inches, light stretch, and just push any kind of overlap back into position. And then with that done, it's always worth getting one piece of tape up the entire length. You don't need to stretch this one. This is merely to keep the other areas kind of nice and flat next to each other. And so that is that side done. Can flip it over, have a look. Absolutely seamless down the middle. That's looking like it's going to be a good match. So I'll get the other half done now, and then we'll move on to the next step. So with them both now taped, we're going to flip them over, and I'm going to put a tiny bit of glue in this join along here, just to permanently join them together while we work on this join in the middle. And you want to make sure you're not using too much for this, especially with water-based glue, because this burr is going to be prone to buckling and distorting if we introduce too much moisture. So just a really light bead all the way along. You can see I'm just sort of flexing the leaves upwards slightly in order to let glue into that join. And then I'm going to put a bit of tape along the length on this side as well. We'll need to make sure we remove this before sticking it down. You definitely don't want tape between the veneer and the substrate, but while this glue's drying, that can just stay there to kind of help keep everything aligned and make sure we don't get any sort of steps or overlapping. And while we're here, we can also start looking at doing the same to these cracks. So we'll start right at the top. And then again, just stretch some veneer tape over it to help clamp it shut. Okay, so with those now dry, we can start thinking about joining this middle area together in order to create our four-way match. As said before, we have got a little bit of a step here, and that's not really uncommon when you're doing things like this. You might have to trim a little bit more off one side than the other in order to get things to match. And so all we're going to do is get a ruler along the edge. I like using one with a handle like this because it keeps my hands nice and clear. And we're just going to use a scalpel to lightly cut off this excess. Much like cutting grooves with a plow plane earlier in this series, I like to start really light towards the end and then gradually work my way up the ruler. And that way you're less likely to get any kind of drift from the knife if you commit to the whole thing at once. You basically commit to a small area, then extend it, and eventually the knife falls into the cut that you've already created. But still very light pressure. I've got a fresh blade on this knife. Okay, so that's our four-way match complete. We've got tape only on one side, and so when we glue this down, this is going to be the face that is up. You never want to glue veneer tape under the veneer, despite that being what the name sometimes implies. Realistically, I could probably take it off because it is all glued together by this point, but we might as well keep it there as extra reinforcement. So the next thing we're going to do is rough cut it to size, slightly oversized actually, according to the tabletop, and then we can start thinking about gluing it down. Now, just reiterate here, this is a quick and dirty veneering process. For example, I never made sure that this cut was 90 degrees to this Bookmatch. And so if we were going for a sort of corner to corner match like this, there's no guarantees that we'd be able to get it to match each point perfectly. And so that's something to watch out for if that's what you're planning on doing. But again, most of that will be covered in this book. This is where all the information is going to be. don't just rely on this video. Anyway, first thing I'm going to do is mark a midpoint on all of the edges of this MDF top. Okay, so next we can start thinking about gluing up, seeing as the top and the balancing veneer are all cut to size. Just a little side note on the purpose of a balancing veneer. It's not just for aesthetic reasons if you were to look under the table. It's actually to prevent this substrate from distorting due to only having glue applied to one side. It could basically swell, or it does something, and it could cause it to sort of bow and cup and things. And by putting a balancing veneer on the other side, it balances the board and it should minimize distortion. Probably wouldn't be a huge issue with something this small and 18 millimeters thick, but certainly on smaller panels, sort of less than 15 millimeters, you will almost certainly experience problems. So that's why we have a balancing veneer. Anyway, when it comes to gluing, we've got a bit of a setup here. Firstly, the glue we're using is this, which is Titebond cold press. I've already explained the difference between a cold and a hot press, so hopefully I don't need to explain why it's called a cold press. But what makes this different to normal wood glue, such as Titebond 2 or 3 or PVA or whatever, is firstly, it's slightly more clay-like, I guess, a bit thicker. And what that prevents is the glue from seeping through the thin veneer grain and showing on the top show face. Because you can imagine that would cause all sorts of issues with regards to finishing and blotching and things like that. Having a slightly thicker solution like this works wonders for that. It also dries translucent, and it's got a, I think on here it's called a moderate speed of set, which accounts to 45 minutes to 2 hours. Realistically, you probably want to leave it longer than that. But if you want to do this job properly, using a good glue such as this is the way to go. There's a link to it in the description. But that's not to say you can't use other glues if that's all you've got available to you. You've just got to be cautious of how much you apply, particularly with regards to that bleed through I mentioned about. In terms of application, there's all sorts of ways you could do it. You could do it with a plastic spreader. You could do it with a old credit card, I don't know. But for me, I'm going to use this. It's actually got a glue reservoir in the top, so if we were doing loads of these panels, you can fill that up and you can apply glue very quickly without having to apply it directly to the board and then spread it out. But because I've only got a small surface area to do, I'm just going to squeeze this straight onto the board and then use the roller portion to spread it out. In terms of clamping, I've got these 2 boards of plywood, which are cut slightly oversized to the top. Then we've got this one going on there. Remember to have the tape up, and then this here. And then we're basically just going to clamp that into one big veneer sandwich. If you've got clamps with quite a long reach on them, you can put pressure in the middle. But because I don't, I've ended up creating these, which are clamping cauls with a very slight bow in them. That means that when I clamp them down at the edges, there's slightly more pressure in the middle before the edges close up, and that should put a nice bit of pressure there. And then we've also got the same happening on the underside, and I've marked that bow with a little circle there. So we'll load that up with clamps, fill in this remaining area with clamps, and then hopefully in 12 hours time or so, we should be able to take all of this apart and have a beautifully veneered sheet of MDF. And even though we shouldn't experience any bleed through from this glue, I'm going to put a sheet of greaseproof paper between the veneer and the plywood sheet, just to make sure it doesn't stick itself together. Make sure our area is nice and dust free. Make sure there's no little bits stuck to the roller. I'm also going to give this glue a little bit of a mix before we apply it as well. So you can definitely feel the sort of thickening agents or whatever it is they tend to use in this settle towards the bottom. Now when veneering, the easiest spot to miss is the corners. So really focus on them when you're spreading out the glue. So when you put it on, the veneer will start kind of bubbling up like this. I think it's because the glue expands the wood fibers on that side and forces it into that kind of cup shape. So just flip it over. That can clamp it for the time being, and then we'll secure it down with tape to stop it slipping while we put the clamps on. Right, so it's 1 day later. Let's have a look. That side feels flat. No overlaps on any of the leaves. Can't feel any bubbling at all. It's a pretty good start. We'll start getting the tape off now. So I've actually been left with a little bit of sticky residue from this veneer tape on the walnut burr side. I've got a feeling it really liked sticking to the veneer conditioner that may still be somewhat present in this, because the walnut on the back came off beautifully. No sticky residue whatsoever. That's exactly how I'd expect this tape to perform. But this side, not so good. We've just got a bit of stickiness in a few places. So I'm just going to try and get it off with some methylated spirit, being careful not to put so much on that we soak through and affects the glue underneath. While you could sand this sticky residue away, the problem is it could make you become too focused on one area rather than others, and clearly we're working with quite a thin veneer here. It'd be very easy to sand through it. Does mean we get to have a sneaky peek at the grain on this as well. Now, in order to trim off the excess around the edges, I like to use a router for this. You can also use a knife, but just make sure to be very careful when doing so, because it's quite easy to accidentally peel up the veneer due to the pressure of this. So when using a router, the general practice is to go against the rotation of the cutter. So with the cutter spinning this way, when you're pushing it, you're pushing against the rotation of it when it starts cutting. With veneer, however, I actually prefer going the other way, which definitely isn't something you should do in the majority of routing operations. It's just veneer is so thin, it's very unlikely to catch on the router and cause kickback. So we've got a small flush bearing on this. Let's get it done. Right, and there you go. That's how you veneer the top. So again, just to reiterate, don't take this as gospel. This top is going to be far from perfect, but as a sort of introduction to kind of get to know the basics of veneering and what sort of things you need and the general process, that is pretty much it. But again, if you want to dive down the rabbit hole more, I couldn't recommend this book enough. In fact, even if you're not doing veneering, just taking a look at this and just being blown away by the things that is possible with this material is very inspiring. So grab that, it's in the description if you want it. And as always, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to press the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.